The wind howled through the canyon as if the mountains themselves were calling for vengeance. The bitter cold gripped the land, a reminder of just how small a man was when pitted against nature. Not many survived the winters of the northern plains, and fewer still were those who lived to tell about it. In the late days of November, when the land turned white and the days shrank like the firewood piled high against the walls of frontier cabins, Jacob Callahan found himself facing the harshest of winters. Jacob was a man of modest means, yet his reputation had spread along the frontier. The wind had a way of singling out the weak, but Jacob had never been one to surrender easily to the elements. His boots, however, had begun to betray him. He had lived through blizzards, dust storms, and fires that had swept through the land, but nothing had prepared him for the savage cold of this particular storm. The thermometer, if such a thing existed out here on the edge of civilization, would doubtless have surely marked the temperature at a solid 30 below. But it wasn't the number on a scale that mattered. It was the wind, the cruel, biting wind that froze a man's soul before it ever touched his skin. His trusted horse, Dusty, stood nearby, her breath visible in the frigid air as she stamped her hooves, seeking warmth. Jacob had made camp by a small creek, but now he found himself sitting on a log, staring down at his boots, wondering if they could carry him through the night. His fingers, stiff from the cold, struggled to tie the leather straps tighter. His old boots, once a reliable companion, were beginning to fail him. The soles were cracked from years of use, the stitching worn thin from 1,000 miles of wilderness. The leather, though thick, had begun to let in the cold. A man could only take so much before his body began to feel the biting sting of frost, and Jacob knew that if he couldn't get his feet warmed soon, he'd lose more than his comfort. As the wind swirled, pushing the snow in all directions, Jacob considered his options. He could try to ride out of the storm, but the wind was relentless, and the darkening sky threatened to swallow him whole. The only choice left was to make do with what he had, and right then, all he had were those boots. His mind raced back to the stories his grandfather used to tell him about the old days. How men would survive by doing the impossible, by using tricks passed down through generations, bits of knowledge from those who had already walked the path. In the distance, the wind screamed its warning, but Jacob Callahan wasn't about to let it win. He had one trick up his sleeve, one that no one had ever thought to question before. The method was simple, yet in its simplicity lay the secret to survival. If only he could make it work. As Jacob tightened the straps, his breath misting in front of him, he glanced up at the sky. The clouds had rolled in thick, and there was no sign of relief. But he wasn't about to let this storm be the end of him. Not yet. Not when he had something in mind, something that could keep his toes from freezing off and keep him alive through the night. Jacob's hands, stiff from the cold, moved with a practiced slowness as he worked on his boots. The wind, relentless as a pack of coyotes in pursuit, screamed through the snow-laden trees, biting at his exposed skin. His breath, like smoke, swirled in the icy air, but the real enemy was the creeping cold that had already begun to sink into his bones. His boots, worn thin by countless miles of travel and too many seasons of hardship, had betrayed him when he needed them most. The leather was cracked, the soles nearly shredded. He could feel the cold creeping into his toes, a gnawing ache that threatened to turn to numbness. But he wasn't ready to die here in this freezing wasteland. Not like this, he had to think. His mind raced back to the stories his grandfather had told him by the fire, tales of frontier tricks passed down from men who had survived the worst winters the land could throw at them. One trick in particular stood out, one his grandfather called foolish, but effective all the same. Jacob had always dismissed it as nonsense, a man's desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. But now, as the wind howled louder, he found himself with little choice. There was no time for pride when it came to surviving the cold. And so, Jacob gathered his few remaining supplies, his fingers shaking as he worked. From his pack, he pulled out a handful of wool. He had enough for a few layers, and the strip of cloth he had been saving for repairs. He unwrapped his boots carefully, trying not to let the cold slip inside. His mind was set now, his determination clearer than ever. The trick, as his grandfather had shown him, wasn't complicated. He had to create an extra layer of insulation. But where most men would simply pack straw or leaves into the soles, Jacob had to get creative. Wool, thick and insulating, was the first choice. He wrapped the wool tightly around his toes, squeezing every last bit of warmth from the small amount he had. Then, with the cloth, he fashioned a crude covering similar to a makeshift mitten, but for his feet. The wool would trap air around his toes, the cloth acting as a barrier against the worst of the cold. Once done, Jacob tied the boots back tightly, securing the layers inside. The task had taken longer than he'd hoped, and the storm was only getting worse. But when he stood up, his feet felt not warm, but tolerable. It was a start. The wind still cut through him like a knife, but the desperation had faded slightly. Jacob flexed his toes inside the boots. The trick had worked. For now. The real test, however, would come when he had to ride through the storm. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. The cold was moving in faster than he could outrun. He mounted Dusty, his horse stamping her hooves in the snow, ready to face the storm head-on. The next few hours would determine whether this crazy trick would be enough to save his toes or if it would be the last mistake he ever made. Jacob's breath came in short, desperate puffs as he urged Dusty forward into the storm. The wind was an unrelenting force, tearing at his clothes, biting through the layers of wool and cloth he'd wrapped around his boots. He could feel the sting in his cheeks, the cold creeping in from every angle, but his feet strangely remained manageable. The trick had worked, at least for now. But it wasn't enough, not by a long shot. The storm raged with a fury that seemed almost personal. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that could freeze a man's soul. The kind of cold that could snuff out a life in minutes if a person wasn't careful. Jacob had seen men go down like that, frozen in place, their bones too stiff to move, their bodies stiff with frostbite. He couldn't let that happen. Not out here, not alone in the wilderness. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the reins tighter, leaning into the wind. Dusty's hooves crunched through the snow with each step, her head low, her breath visible in the air. She was just as much a survivor as he was, yet the two of them were no match for what lay ahead. But Jacob wasn't going to stop, not now. The cold was unbearable, and it seemed to reach deeper into his bones the longer he stayed out there. He flexed his toes again. The wool and cloth inside his boots felt like they had a small amount of warmth, just enough to keep him from freezing. But every step took him further into the storm, and with every mile it felt like the wind bit harder. The sound of it, roaring in his ears, was deafening. It pushed against him, a constant pressure that made it feel like the world was trying to force him to his knees. The wind picked up again, this time with such intensity that Jacob had to fight to keep his footing. Dusty whinnied in protest as she struggled to stay steady, her eyes wide with fear. Jacob's instincts told him to turn back, but he ignored them. He had made it this far, and to turn around now would mean certain death. He had no choice but to keep moving. His face stung from the cold, his cheeks raw where the wind had scraped them. His fingers, though still working, had started to feel the effects of the frost. But it was his feet that had become his concern. They were still warm, but just barely. He could feel the numbness creeping in, but he pressed on, focusing on the trick he'd used to keep his toes from freezing. It had worked for a while, but the real test was coming now. Ahead, he saw the faint outline of a cabin, its dark silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. The light from inside shone like a beacon in the storm, a promise of warmth, of safety. He pushed Dusty harder, spurring her forward. Every step brought them closer, but the storm was relentless. Jacob's Dottie. Determination was stronger than ever, but the cold was starting to win. The cabin was close. He just had to make it there, just a few more steps. The wind howled louder, as if it were screaming a warning, a final attempt to turn Jacob back. But there was no turning back now. The storm had become his enemy, and survival was the only thing that mattered. Every step, every jolt in the saddle, sent shivers through his body. But his mind was focused on one thing, reaching the shelter of that cabin. Dusty struggled against the wind, her body tense with every gust, her legs slipping slightly in the deepening snow. Jacob could feel her muscles quivering beneath him, her resolve as strong as his own. The horse had carried him through thick and thin, but this storm felt different. It was like a living thing, a beast made of ice and fury, determined to break them both. But Jacob wasn't about to let it win. He pushed Dusty harder, leaning forward, clutching the reins tighter. He could see the faint glow of the cabin's light growing brighter through the swirling snow, the warmth that would be waiting for him, just a few more steps away. It was a beacon in the endless white, a promise of safety. His feet, now cold despite the trick, had begun to ache. The wool and cloth inside his boots were still holding, but just barely. He could feel the frost creeping in around the edges, as if the cold was testing him, pushing him to see how much he could withstand. His toes tingled with the numbness that threatened to overtake them. Each jolt in the saddle sent a shock of pain through his legs, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. The storm was relentless, as if it were trying to swallow him whole. His breath came in sharp bursts, forming small clouds of steam before vanishing in the air. The snow seemed to fall in sheets, blocking out everything except the dim outline of the cabin ahead. It was a cruel joke. The closer he got, the harder it became to move forward. The wind pushed him from every side, whipping his face, his body, until every inch of him felt frozen to the core. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Dusty's hooves sank deeper into the snow with each step. Her breath was ragged, and Jacob could see the frost forming around her nostrils. They were both reaching their limit, but they couldn't afford to stop. The wind screamed louder, biting at Jacob's exposed skin, but he pressed on, his body numb from the cold, his hands aching from the frozen reins. The cabin was so close now. A few more steps, a few more heartbeats, and they would be there. The light beckoned like a salvation, promising warmth, shelter, and the end of the storm. He could almost taste it. Dusty's legs faltered, but Jacob urged her on, whispering to her as he leaned into the saddle. The cold had sapped their strength, but they were so close now. Just a few more moments, and they could rest. They could survive. Then, a sudden gust of wind hit with such force that it nearly threw Jacob from the saddle. He clenched his teeth, his body bracing against the fury of the storm. It was then that he heard it, the faintest sound of cracking ice underfoot. The cabin was right there. But would they make it? Jacob's body felt as though it had been split in two. His legs were stiff from the cold, his arms numb, and his feet, despite the trick, had begun to throb with a deep, aching coldness. The wind still howled, though its fury had lessened, and the snow seemed to fall in a more muted, gentle cascade. The cabin was only a few yards away now, but each step felt like a mile. Dusty's hooves clopped softly, her movements sluggish, as if she, too, was running on fumes. They had made it, but barely. The door to the cabin stood open, a faint light spilling into the snow, offering the warmth of the hearth, the safety of four walls. Jacob's heart raced as he urged Dusty forward, his body barely able to move with the exhaustion and cold that had crept into the safe. His bones. The sight of that door was like a lifeline, and yet, even as he saw it so close, he couldn't escape the heavy weight of the storm's remnants still hanging over him. Jacob dismounted with a groan, his legs nearly buckling beneath him as the cold in his feet surged with each movement. He reached for Dusty's reins, but his hands, frozen stiff, barely responded. The wool and cloth he had stuffed into his boots had held, but only just. His toes were numb, unfeeling, yet the pain had started to build, a painful reminder of how close he had come to losing them. Every part of him wanted to collapse right there in the snow, to surrender to the warmth that awaited inside. But he knew he couldn't, not yet. The storm might be weakening, but it was still there, lingering in the bones of the earth, in the very air that surrounded him. It could be deadly if he let his guard down now. Dusty, too, seemed to sense the urgency in the air. She snorted, her breath puffing out invisible clouds, and Jacob gave her one last look before he pushed himself through the door. The warmth hit him like a wave, almost too much for his frozen skin to handle. His face burned as the heat of the hearth reached his bones, the fire crackling and dancing in the center of the cabin. Jacob sank to his knees in front of it, gasping for breath. He removed his boots slowly, the chill still biting at his toes, but now the warmth of the fire began to take over. He could feel the slow return of sensation in his feet, the deep ache of blood rushing back into frozen flesh. It was a pain he welcomed, a sign that he had made it, that he had survived. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin it was quiet, safe. As Jacob sat there, exhausted and cold but alive, the weight of the night began to lift. He had made it through the worst of the storm, but he knew the land would always be watching, always testing, always waiting for weakness, and next time he would be ready.